Hey everybody, today's project on the 1966 Lincoln Continental is going to be pulling out the full rear suspension. That means pulling the leaf springs on both sides, pulling both shocks, especially because the shocks have helper springs, which are not stock or authentic or original, and that effectively means we're going to be pulling out the full rear end. The goal is to get the leaf springs re-arched, and so I want to keep those original leaf springs. I am also going to be sourcing original shocks, and I'm also going to be cleaning up, wire brushing the rear end, repainting it, and making it look really, really good before we put it back in. So let's get started.
To set up for this project, the first thing we want to do is make sure that the jack stands are in the right location. So we have them just outside of the rear shackle on both sides of the car, and also have a pair of jack stands underneath the rear end, since we will be removing the full rear end and not just the leaf springs. To pull out the drive shaft requires removing 4 half-inch bolts. So I'm going to remove these first 2 while the car is in park. I'm then going to put it in neutral, rotate the drive shaft 180 degrees, put it back in park, and then remove bolts 3 and 4. With the first 2 bolts out, the car is now in neutral. I'm going to rotate this 180 degrees so we can get these final 2 bolts out now. Great. We should now be able to move the drive shaft. With the drive shaft now out, we're going to remove the e-brake cable, which includes taking it out of the backing plate, as well as removing the bracket that holds it onto the leaf spring.
Next up, removing the rear brake line. Now in your car, we're hoping it's a little bit easier. I had to cut mine out. I do plan on replacing it, so no big deal there. But you will need a 3/8 flare nut on this side and a 5/8 wrench to hold this side. And on here, you'll need the 3/8 flare wrench as well. The reason I had to cut mine out is this side was not cooperating. It was getting stuck and wanted to round out as I was using the flare nut, even after having soaked it for about 24 hours in PB Blaster. So I'm either going to be replacing this flared end or replacing this full brake line. But now the rear brake line is out of the car.
We're now ready to remove the rear shock, and we're going to start with the lower mount, which is going to use a 3/4 inch socket. With the lower nut of the shock off, we can now remove the top mount, which is held in with 3 9/16 bolts. With all the hardware removed, we can now pull off the shock. We're now ready to get started on removing the rear leaf spring, and we're going to start by removing the 2 U-bolts, one on each side of the leaf spring, which is held on with 4 nuts, 2 on each U-bolt, which are a 3/4 inch nut. So let's get those pulled off now. With all 4 nuts off, the U-bolts can now come off from over the rear end. With the U-joints out, we're now to the front of the leaf spring where we're going to remove the 3/4 inch nut and stud from the front mount. We're now on the other side of the leaf spring where we're now going to pull off this nut, and that will allow this stud to come out and allow the leaf spring to drop down. With the nuts and washers off of both sides, we just now need to push this stud through, and I'm just going to use a really big screwdriver. The stud is already out from the other side of the hanger, so now it's just pulling the stud. Now I do have the leaf spring underneath a jack right now, which is why this is still held in place, but we can start lowering that down and now work on the rear side of the leaf spring. To drop the rear side of the leaf spring and leaf spring only without the bracket would require removing this nut and then also removing a bolt that would come out here. However, there's not enough clearance for that bolt to clear this part of the bracket. So instead, I'm going to drop the bracket and the leaf spring down together. Now, these nuts appear to be welded onto the bracket, and so what I'm going to do is just loosen the bolts. There's going to be 4 of them, and I'm going to use a 3/4 inch open end wrench, and that's mainly because there's not really enough room to get between the muffler and the head of the bolt with a socket and socket wrench. So let's get started on that part of the project now. That is the last bolt, and now the leaf spring and bracket are free hanging. The only reason it hasn't dropped down yet, and the main reason for that it hasn't dropped down yet, is I have a jack holding it up. So this is now loose, and we're now able to drop the full leaf spring out of the car. You will see that I was able to fully get 3 of the 4 bolts out of the car. The last one I was not able to get fully out, given that it's hitting up against the muffler. Now this would be 100% fine to leave as is until the leaf spring and leaf spring bracket are ready to be reinstalled.
However, while I won't show it in the video now, I am going to drop the muffler down just so I can take that full bolt out, because I do plan on cleaning up all the hardware, cleaning up the frame and everything before the leaf spring goes back in. We're now done with the driver's side, and as you can see, the rear end is only being held up by a jack stand. So we're now going to go to the passenger side to remove everything in the same process we did on the driver's side. As mentioned, now that we're on the passenger side, we're going to go through the same process where we are going to remove the e-brake cable. We're then going to remove the shock, both the lower mount and top mount, and then we're going to remove the leaf spring. Now, I'm not going to record that since it's the same process as before, but when I do get to the leaf spring, I am going to show some content there, as I'm going to remove the front of the leaf spring differently than I did on the driver's side. On the passenger side, and again, I've already removed the e-brake cable, I've already removed the shock, and removed the U-bolts that are holding the leaf spring to the rear end. And so now the only thing keeping this leaf spring in is it's being held in by both the front and the back. Now on the driver's side, if you recall, I removed the nuts, removed the stud, and then was able to lower the leaf spring down. But on this side, I'm going to make it a little bit easier, and I'm going to do what I did on the rear side of the driver's side leaf spring, and I'm actually going to remove the full bracket with it. And I'm going to remove that utilizing a 13/16 socket wrench. Great. Now all 4 bolts are removed. This is ready to drop down. I do have a nice trusted jack underneath it, as I'm now going to remove the back. Again, I will not be recording that. I just wanted to show the different way that you could take off the front side. All right, the rear suspension is now fully out of the car, and the rear end, as you can see here, is only being propped up by the 2 jack stands and is free of the car. As you can see, we have the full rear suspension out of the car, and as mentioned, as you saw in the previous part of the video, the rear end is fully and completely removed from the car and is just sitting on jack stands. All right, with the rear suspension now out of the car, including the full rear end, the shocks, as well as the leaf springs, I'm now going to take the leaf springs down to a local shop about an hour away from me in Oakland, California, to get those leaf springs re-arched. So stay tuned for more content on the restoration project of my 1966 Lincoln Continental. Thanks, guys.